Being uninformed is a state of fact. Being ignorant is a state of mind.
Write that down.
I don't have a pencil.
Well, remember that then.
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and yesterday I started getting a bunch of DMs. What do I think of Bill Barr throwing Donald Trump under the bus, confirming there was no election fraud?
Let's get into it.
But first things first, under my terms of service contract with YouTube, I am legally required to advise all of you that the Associated Press has declared the election won in favor of President-elect Joe Biden, and yes, I am joking. Sometimes in today's day and age, it is impossible to tell truth from parody. So what is this news that everybody's talking about? And incidentally, I will be talking about it tonight with Robert Barnes during our midweek live stream. Apparently, Bill Barr has thrown Donald Trump under the bus by confirming that there was no election fraud. Everybody's been tweeting about it online, and I say I have to take a closer look. A lot of people on Twitter tweeting that Bill Barr has confirmed no fraud. The headline of the Associated Press article says something different. The body of the article says something even different. And the last two paragraphs of that article say something even more different. Disputing Trump, Barr says no widespread election fraud. I have done a bunch of videos on what is required in order to digest the mainstream media, and just looking at this headline, I noticed something very interesting in that they are creating conflict that may not exist in the headline itself. There is a big difference between Barr saying there is no widespread election fraud and Barr disputing Trump saying there is no widespread election fraud. One creates conflict, the other one does not necessarily imply conflict. Maybe Michael Balsamo will include information in the article to substantiate the suggestion that Barr was disputing Trump when he made the assertion that there was no widespread fraud. We'll see. But for now, all I'm reading is that headline creates conflict where no conflict necessarily exists. But heck, it's good for the clickbait, and it got me, so let's read the article. Disputing President Donald Trump's persistent, baseless claims, Attorney General William Barr declared Tuesday the U.S. Justice Department has uncovered no evidence of widespread voter fraud that could change the outcome of the 2020 election.
Whoa.
The headline of this article said that William Barr confirmed that there was no widespread election fraud, yet the final portion of the introductory paragraph now says that Barr and the Department of Justice is confirming that there was no widespread voter fraud susceptible of changing the outcome of the election. That is a very big difference. But before we even get there, I want to draw your attention to the intellectual sleight of hand that is being carried out in the first words of this article, in that they are setting up the conclusion. They are telling you what to think before giving you the information so that you frame all of the information you get with that foregone conclusion.
Persistent, baseless claims.
The article leads with the conclusion. Now, in law, and I've said this in previous vlogs, this is tantamount to arguing from a conclusion as opposed to towards one. They're telling you in advance that the claims are persistent and baseless so that you view all of the information in the article accordingly. But spoiler alert, the information in the article is not exactly going to support that foregone conclusion. But getting back to this ultimate sleight of hand in the difference between the headline and the second portion of that introductory paragraph, the headline says that William Barr confirms there was no widespread election fraud. The introductory paragraph discreetly adds the qualifier that there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud susceptible of changing the outcome of the election. What does that imply? There is evidence of widespread voter fraud, just not sufficient to affect the outcome of the election. To say that there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud that could change the outcome of the election necessarily means that there was evidence of widespread voter fraud. Otherwise, you would not have phrased the sentence that way. Now, I always say it is not a good idea to argue from an imperfect analogy when you have a perfect example, but I'm going to give you an example that will illustrate what I'm saying. If someone says to you that there is no food in your fridge susceptible of giving you a stomachache, it does not mean that there is no food in your fridge. On the contrary, it necessarily means there is food in your fridge, but none of it is susceptible of giving you a stomachache. No evidence of widespread voter fraud is fundamentally and intrinsically different than no evidence of widespread voter fraud that could have changed the outcome of the election. Now, I know some of you out there are probably going to be saying that I am putting too much emphasis on the term widespread. I am focusing on it to falsify the discussion, but if the term widespread added nothing to that sentence, they would not have included it in that sentence. They would have just said that there was no evidence of voter fraud susceptible of changing the outcome of the election. Words have meanings, especially in journalism, and while I think use of the term widespread in and of itself is susceptible of confusion, the fact that they have phrased it this way is done for a specific reason. It necessarily admits of the fact that there might very well be widespread voter fraud, but now we are coming to the subjective determination that it would not have been susceptible to change the outcome of the election, and that is a very crucial, important distinction, and and an admission, I would say. Okay, but moving on in the article. Barr's comments in an interview with the Associated Press contradict the concerted effort by Trump, his boss, to subvert the results of last month's voting and block President-elect Joe Biden from taking his place in the White House. Again, here you can read this entire paragraph and really appreciate that this entire paragraph is arguing from a conclusion and not towards one, that conclusion being that there was nothing wrong with the election, therefore Trump is trying to subvert it. Or that Trump is trying to block Joe Biden from taking his place in the White House. Hypothetically, if the election were affected by fraud, Trump would not be subverting anything. It wouldn't be blocking Joe Biden, and it wouldn't be Joe Biden's place in the White House. Hypothetically, I am saying, hypothetically, if we are not operating on the foregone conclusion that there was nothing wrong with the election whatsoever. Now, you may agree with that foregone conclusion. You may think the election was totally fine, that Joe Biden is the legitimate president-elect. That is fine. It is just important to appreciate that that is the foregone conclusion infused in the drafting of this paragraph. It is arguing from a conclusion, not towards one, and everything is drafted accordingly. Barr told the AP that U.S. attorneys and FBI agents have been working to follow up specific complaints and information they've received, but, quote, to date, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election, end quote. Translation, Bill Barr is confirming the existence of fraud, but
with a but.
The comments, which drew immediate criticism from Trump attorneys, were especially notable coming from Barr, who has been one of the president's most ardent allies. Before the election, he had repeatedly raised the notion that mail-in voting could be especially vulnerable to fraud during the coronavirus pandemic, as Americans feared going to polls and instead chose to vote by mail. And this highlights one of the most quintessential examples of confirmation bias you are ever going to see. When Bill Barr was complaining about the risk of fraud for mail-in voting, he was not to be trusted, but now that he is confirming that there was no widespread fraud on a scale large enough to affect the outcome, he is to be trusted, but don't take my word for it. Marshall Cohen, CNN reporter, covered the 26th election, Russia investigation, impeachment, coronavirus, 2020 election, previously CBS News, Northwestern alum from Philly. Bill Barr, lying in June. A foreign country could print up tens of thousands of counterfeit ballots and be very hard for us to detect. Bill Barr, telling the truth in December. We have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. To which I respond with the following undumb tweet, if I do say so myself. This is the definition of lack of self-awareness confirmation bias. Someone is lying when you disagree with them, but telling the truth when you agree with them. The article then discusses other administration officials who have been recently fired, hypothesizing as to whether or not Bill Barr is going to get fired for contradicting Trump on this issue, thereby creating a reality that doesn't actually exist yet, but whatever. I want to get to another point, which is a common talking point I see everywhere. The Trump campaign team led by Giuliani has been alleging a widespread conspiracy by Democrats to dump millions of illegal votes into the system with no evidence. They have filed multiple lawsuits in battleground states alleging that partisan poll watchers didn't have a clear enough view at polling sites in some locations, and therefore something illegal must have happened. The claims have been repeatedly dismissed, including by Republican judges who have ruled the suits lacked evidence. This is a talking point that I am seeing everywhere, and it lacks nuance because it lacks understanding. You often hear people saying Trump filed 35 lawsuits, all but one have been dismissed. The reality is that the majority of those lawsuits that were filed were not necessarily even Trump suits to begin with. And the Trump lawsuits that have in fact been dismissed have not been dismissed on evidentiary issues. They did not even get to the evidentiary stages. The injunction lawsuits that were filed on the basis that poll watchers were being denied proper observation of the counting, they were dismissed because the counting had occurred, the question became moot, therefore there was nothing to adjudicate upon anymore. The other lawsuits that were dismissed in Pennsylvania, in particular by a Republican judge, were not dismissed on the basis of lack of evidence, they were dismissed on the basis of lack of standing. And there is a critical difference between lack of standing and lack of evidence. Lack of standing, you don't even get to the evidentiary stage. Now, I'm not trying to spin it. Being told that you don't have standing to bring a suit is never a good thing, but that is different than being told that you don't have evidence to support that suit. It is just being told that you don't have the legal interest to file that suit in the first place. And why was the Trump campaign told that they lacked legal standing to file the suit? Well, the judge determined that they had not suffered an injury in fact as the campaign and not as an individual voter, and therefore they lacked the standing to file the suit in the first place. It is admittedly a very complicated, subtle legal distinction, nuance to that commonly repeated talking point, and at the very least, maybe now you can appreciate that so you are not guilty of repeating that talking point yourself. Now, moving on with the article, but always bearing in mind that we were told up front that there was nothing to see here. The issues they have pointed to are typical in every election. Problems with signatures, secrecy envelopes, and postal marks on mail-in ballots, as well as the potential for a small number of ballots miscast or lost. Previously on Dexter, we were told that there was in fact no fraud. Now we're being basically told that there is always fraud. Those are two very different statements, and we are being told that, it might only be in the thousands of ballots. Well, when certain states were only decided by thousands of ballots, and when in certain states the actual results were overturned because they discovered missing ballots, it becomes a little more difficult to deny. But they've gone further. Attorney Sidney Powell has spun fictional tales of election systems flipping votes, German servers storing U.S. voting information, and election software created in Venezuela, quote, at the direction of Hugo Chavez, end quote, the late Venezuelan president who died in 2013. Powell has since been removed from the legal team after an interview she gave where she threatened to, quote, Georgia with a, quote, biblical court filing. For those of you who have been around the channel for long enough, you know my position on Sidney Powell's public statements and the subsequent court filings. If you are new to the channel and you have not yet seen those videos, go back and watch them. They will be insightful if I
do say so myself.
And as others have pointed out, apparently Sidney Powell was never formally part of Trump's legal team, so she could not have been removed or fired from that team. It might be a semantic distinction, but whatever, it is a question of fact that people should digest accordingly. Barr didn't name Powell specifically, but said, quote, there's been one assertion that would be systemic fraud, and that would be the claim that machines were programmed essentially to skew the election results. And the DHS and DOJ have looked into that, and so far we haven't seen anything to substantiate that, end quote. In the campaign statement, Giuliani claimed there was, quote, ample evidence of illegal voting in at least 6 states which they have not examined, end quote. And then we get to the end of the article, which contains probably the most important fact buried deep down in the final 3 paragraphs. However, Barr said earlier that people were confusing the use of the federal criminal justice system with allegations that should be made in civil lawsuits. He said a remedy for many complaints would be a top-down audit by state or local officials, not the U.S. Justice Department. Quote, there's a growing tendency to use the criminal justice system as a sort of default fix-all, he said. But first, there must be a basis to believe there is a crime to investigate. Quote, most claims of fraud are very particularized to a particular set of circumstances or actors or conduct. And those have been run down. They are being run down, Barr said. Some have been broad and potentially cover a few thousand votes. They have been followed up on. Call me cynical, suggest that I have reading problems, but I don't think I'm the only person getting mixed messages from this article. Which brings us right back to the intro of this video. Being uninformed is a state of fact. Being ignorant is a state of mind. Brian Stelter at Brian Stelter. This is no longer about just voter fraud or electoral fraud. This is something much bigger, Lou Dobbs said tonight, urging Trump to take, quote, drastic action because of, quote, the crimes that have been committed against him and the American people. Now, in response to this tweet, I asked what was genuinely a genuine question, and I hate Twitter so much because even genuine questions come off with some degree of sass on Twitter. Did you listen to the Arizona hearings today? Serious question. Did you listen to the Pennsylvania hearings? Serious question. And when I saw the responses, it just became very depressingly clear to me how people go about making their decisions as to what is fact, what is fiction, what they're going to pay attention to, and what they're going to outright ignore. All because they are arguing from conclusions and not towards them. They weren't hearings. Look up the definition of kangaroo court. There's a reason state legislature leaders don't want to be involved. There weren't any hearings. In what sense were those hearings? They weren't hearings. And it's something I actually just tweeted this morning, but adding periods in between words does not add substance, and it does not add legitimacy to an argument. Irrelevant bad faith exercises such as those, quote, hearings do not deserve our attention. No, because there were no hearings. Hearings are held in court or a state level, not at hotels. Forming an opinion while deliberately ignoring some information is not being uninformed, it is being ignorant, and being uninformed is a state of fact, being ignorant is a state of mind. Whether you ultimately agree or disagree with that information, whether you ultimately disregard that information entirely, to outright ignore it is not to be informed, it is just to close your eyes and insist on being right. Alright, and with that said, if you like my videos and you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm. If you want to support the channel, all of the support links are in the pinned comment. We've got PayPal, Patreon, Subscribe Star, YouTube membership. We've got merch. Be sure to check out Robert Barnes and I on vivabarneslaw.locals.com. Check out our live stream tonight. It's going to be amazing. But more important than any of that, take care of yourselves. Check in on friends and family. Make sure everyone around you is doing well. And now you know you're Vlawg. Peace out. Boom.